Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story, one that begins with a life-changing proposal. A young man finds himself facing an impossible choice, and a woman steps into his life in the most unexpected way. This story is about love, transformation, and how fate can change everything when you least expect it. What will Mark decide? How will his life change? Stay tuned for the next part of the story. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story, one that begins with a life-changing proposal. A young man finds himself facing an impossible choice, and a woman steps into his life in the most unexpected way. This story is about love, transformation, and how fate can change everything when you least expect it. What will Mark decide? How will his life change? Stay tuned for the next part of the story. Mark stood outside the bistro, staring at his phone. Eleanor's words echoed in his mind, as if they were trapped in his head, refusing to let him go. A business deal, she said. Marry her and she would pay off his debts, give him security. The weight of it all settled heavily on his shoulders. Could he really do it? Was he willing to marry someone he barely knew, just for financial freedom? He shook his head, trying to clear the thoughts swirling around inside. He had to make a decision, but how could he? He looked down at the phone once more and noticed a message from his mother. It read, "Mark, your father's medical bills are due. Please try to find a way to help. We're running out of time." He sighed, feeling the pressure of the world crashing down on him. He had always promised his mother he would take care of her, but how could he when everything seemed so impossible? He glanced back at the bistro, where Eleanor sat, waiting patiently. Was this his way out? Was this the chance he had been waiting for? The next day, Mark stood in front of his bathroom mirror, the cold water splashing on his face as he tried to shake off the exhaustion of the past few days. He had barely slept, tossing and turning, going over every possible outcome in his head. Finally, he made up his mind. He would go back to Eleanor and accept her offer. It wasn't ideal, but what choice did he have? His family needed him. He needed this. He knew it would be hard to accept such a proposal, but deep down, he also knew that it was the only way to secure the future he wanted for his family. The weight of the decision still felt heavy, but it also felt like the only logical step. At 6:45 p.m., Mark arrived at the Brooks Bistro once again. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he pushed open the door. Eleanor was already there, sitting at the same table as before. This time, she wasn't alone. A lawyer sat beside her, looking as calm and composed as Eleanor herself. Mark's nerves were on edge as he walked over to the table. "Mark, I'm glad you could make it," Eleanor said with a smile, her voice soothing. She gestured to the chair opposite her. "Please, take a seat." Mark hesitated for a moment, then sat down. He felt the weight of the moment, the decision that would change everything. "I've thought about it," Mark said, his voice low. "And I'm ready to accept your offer." The lawyer nodded and pushed a contract across the table toward him. Mark stared at the papers, feeling a sense of dread. It was real. This was happening. He could barely bring himself to look at the fine print. "Just sign here," the lawyer said. Eleanor's eyes were on him, watching carefully, waiting for him to make the final move. Mark took a deep breath, signed the contract, and pushed it back across the table. It's done, he said, trying to sound confident, but his voice wavered slightly. Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was more like the smile of someone who knew they had just taken control of the situation. She stood up and extended her hand to him. "Welcome to the family, Mark," she said. The words sounded final, like a new chapter was about to begin. Mark shook her hand, feeling the weight of what he had just done. This was it. His life was about to change forever. As Mark left the bistro, he couldn't help but feel a sense of emptiness. He had done what he had to do, but the feeling of signing a contract to marry a stranger left a bitter taste in his mouth. Was it the right decision? Would this really solve all his problems? He walked through the streets, the cool night air doing little to calm his racing thoughts. As he reached his apartment, he found his mother's voice in his mind again. "Please try to find a way to help," she had said. This was the way. He had no choice but to move forward. He would have to learn to live with this decision, even if it felt like a lie. But what was the alternative? The future was uncertain, but at least now, he had a chance to build something better for his family. What will happen next? How will Mark and Eleanor's arrangement unfold? Stay tuned for the next part of the story. Mark sat in his apartment, staring at the papers in front of him. The contract. It was real now. He had agreed to marry Eleanor, not out of love, but out of necessity. His mind raced, replaying the moment he signed his name on the dotted line. He had done it for his family, for his mother's medical bills, and for the debts his father had left behind. But now, he was alone with his thoughts, and the weight of his decision felt heavier than ever. Was he really ready to live a life with someone he barely knew? A woman who had approached him with a cold, businesslike offer? Was this really the solution to all his problems? The apartment felt colder now, quieter. The life he had known seemed so distant, as if he had stepped into a different world, a world where love and family were just distant memories. The next morning, Mark received a message from Eleanor. It was short and to the point. "Meet me at the office at 10 a.m. We have a few things to discuss." He glanced at the clock. It was 9:30. He had half an hour to get ready, but he didn't feel ready. He wasn't sure what to expect. His mind was still clouded with doubts, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't back out now. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and left his apartment, feeling like he was stepping into an entirely new life. As he entered the Brooks Enterprises building, he was greeted by the polished, sleek interior. Everything about the place screamed wealth and power. It felt like a world that was so far removed from his own. The receptionist led him to a conference room where Eleanor was already waiting. She was sitting at the head of the table, her posture perfect, her expression calm and unreadable. There was a sense of authority about her, a power that Mark couldn't ignore. "Good morning, Mark," Eleanor said as he entered. "Please, have a seat." She gestured to the chair across from her. Mark hesitated for a moment before sitting down. He felt like he was on trial, though he wasn't sure what he had done wrong. He had agreed to the arrangement. Wasn't that enough? "I trust you've had time to think about everything," Eleanor continued, her voice steady. "Now that we have the formalities out of the way, there are a few things we need to discuss. First, you will begin attending family events with me. You will be introduced to my business associates, and we will maintain the appearance of a married couple." Mark nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He hadn't realized how much of his life was about to be shared with a stranger, how much of his freedom he was about to give up. Eleanor wasn't asking for his love, but she was asking for something else entirely: his compliance, his presence. It was a strange feeling, but he had no choice. He had to play along. "I understand," Mark said, though it felt more like he was speaking the words to himself than to her. Eleanor looked at him for a moment, as if studying him. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of something that Mark couldn't quite place. Was it pity? Or something else? He couldn't tell. "Good," she said, breaking the silence. You'll also be receiving a generous allowance, and all of your debts will be taken care of. I want to make sure you're comfortable during this arrangement. You'll be part of my world now. She paused, her gaze hardening. But remember, this is strictly business. There are no personal attachments, no expectations of love. We're doing this for the greater good, for both of us. Mark nodded again, though the words stung. He wasn't sure if he was more relieved by the financial security she promised or unsettled by the coldness of the arrangement. Could he really live like this? Could he really pretend to be someone's husband, knowing it was just a role, a performance? The doubt lingered, but he pushed it aside. He had to focus on the bigger picture. He had to do this. Is there anything else? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Eleanor paused for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. Just one thing, she said. You're mine now, Mark. I expect you to uphold the terms of this agreement. And don't forget this is a partnership. You have your role to play, and I have mine. Do well, and we both get what we want. Fail, and, well, that's not an option. She gave him a tight-lipped smile. It wasn't kind, but it wasn't cold either. It was a smile that said, this is business, and nothing more. Mark felt his stomach tighten. He left the meeting feeling more uncertain than ever. The path ahead was clear, but it didn't feel like the right one. He had made his choice, but now that he was walking down this road, he wondered if he could truly follow through. What would happen when the lines between fake and real started to blur? Mark walked back to his apartment, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had no idea what he had signed up for, but one thing was certain: his life was never going to be the same again. What will Mark face next? How will his role in Eleanor's world unfold? Stay tuned for the next part of the story. Mark woke up the next morning feeling the weight of his decision heavier than ever. The contract he had signed the day before was a constant reminder of what he had agreed to: an arrangement, a deal, not a marriage built on love, but on necessity. He stood in front of his mirror, staring at his reflection. The man looking back at him was the same, yet somehow different. His life had shifted, not just in terms of his finances, but in the very fabric of his being. He had agreed to play a part in Eleanor's world, but he still wasn't sure how to navigate it. Eleanor. She wasn't the warm, loving type he imagined a partner to be. Her cold, calculated approach to life was unsettling, but he knew he had no choice. He had committed to this path, and now he had to walk it. At 9 a.m., Mark arrived at the Brooks Enterprises office, unsure of what the day would hold. As he stepped off the elevator, the sleek, modern design of the building reminded him once again that he was entering a world far removed from his own. Eleanor's office was at the top, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of the city. He was ushered in by her assistant, a perfectly groomed young woman who led him to a large conference room where Eleanor was already waiting. Good morning, Mark, Eleanor said, her tone as calm and controlled as always. Please, sit. She gestured to the chair across from her. Mark hesitated for a moment before sitting down, his heart beating a little faster than usual. This was his life now: business meetings, appearances, pretending to be something he wasn't. I trust you've settled in? She asked, her eyes scanning him. Yes, Mark replied, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Eleanor gave him a faint smile, almost as if she could see right through him. I know this is a lot to process, Mark, she said, leaning forward slightly, but now that you're part of my world, there are expectations you need to meet. We need to attend a charity gala this weekend. It's a high-profile event, and we'll be introduced as husband and wife. I need you to be on your best behavior. Mark nodded, though he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. I understand, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He had attended plenty of events in his life, but this felt different. This wasn't a casual gathering, it was a test. His test. The stakes were higher now. Good, Eleanor replied, her gaze never leaving him. There will be photographers, media, business partners. Everyone will be watching. You need to present yourself as if this is real. As if we've been married for years. She paused for a moment before continuing, do you think you can handle that? Mark felt a pang of frustration. He had agreed to this arrangement, but the more Eleanor spoke, the more it felt like he was losing control. Everything was carefully calculated, from the way she spoke to the way she expected him to behave. I'll do my best, Mark said, forcing a smile. Eleanor nodded, satisfied with his response. Good. Remember, this isn't just about the public eye. There are other things at play here. You're not just my husband for show, there are deeper reasons for this arrangement. But for now, focus on the gala. We need to keep up appearances. The days leading up to the gala felt like a blur for Mark. He had a growing sense of unease as the event approached, knowing he was stepping into a world where everything would be scrutinized. He spent hours getting ready, trying on various outfits, making sure everything was perfect. Eleanor had made it clear nothing less than perfection would do. On the night of the gala, he arrived at the venue, dressed in a sharp suit that fit perfectly, his nerves still a bit on edge. As he walked into the grand ballroom, he couldn't help but feel out of place. The room was filled with high-profile individuals, all dressed to the nines, sipping champagne and exchanging business cards. Eleanor was at his side, her presence commanding, like she was born for this world. She introduced him to several important people, her hand on his arm, playing the role of the perfect couple. He did his best to keep up, nodding and smiling, but inside, he felt like an imposter. It wasn't until the speeches started that Mark truly felt the weight of what he had entered. Eleanor stood beside him, her posture perfect, her eyes fixed on the stage. She was in her element, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was just a pawn in her carefully orchestrated world. He had promised to be her husband for this event, but as the night wore on, he began to question everything. Was this really all there was to it? Was his role just to be a shadow in her life? He didn't have the answers, but as the night came to a close, he realized one thing: his life would never be the same. Mark walked back to his apartment later that night, his mind racing. The gala had been a success, but it left him with more questions than answers. How much of this was really about business? How much of it was about her controlling his every move? And how long could he keep pretending? He knew he couldn't keep up this act forever. But for now, he had no choice. What will Mark do next? How will his relationship with Eleanor evolve? Stay tuned for the next part of the story. Mark woke up the next morning with a headache, the kind that comes from too many thoughts swirling around in your head. The night after the gala had been long, filled with more questions than answers. Eleanor had been flawless, just like always. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was slowly losing himself in this arrangement. He had agreed to marry her for the sake of his family, but he was starting to feel like a stranger in his own life. The act of pretending to be someone he wasn't was becoming harder to maintain. Every day, the weight of the situation grew heavier. He couldn't keep playing this role forever, could he? He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie, trying to push the doubts aside. Today was another business meeting, another day to keep up appearances. Eleanor had asked him to accompany her to a high-profile investment meeting. The stakes were higher now. He wasn't just a stand-in husband anymore. He was becoming more deeply involved in her world, a world that didn't seem to have room for his own desires. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he signed that contract, but it definitely wasn't this. Eleanor wasn't just asking him to be her husband, she was asking him to be her partner in every sense of the word, without the love, just the business. Mark sighed as he grabbed his coat and headed out the door. He had made a commitment, and he was going to see it through, no matter how uncomfortable it felt. The drive to the meeting was quiet, the city skyline blurring past him as his thoughts continued to race. What would his life look like if he kept going down this path? Eleanor had made it clear this wasn't about love. It was about power, control, and business. But what about him? What did he get out of this? Yes, his debts were paid, and his family was taken care of, but at what cost? He had become a part of Eleanor's world, but he still felt like an outsider in it. Was he really just a pawn in her game? He didn't have the answers, but he had to keep pretending, at least for now. When they arrived at the meeting, Eleanor was her usual composed self, shaking hands and making small talk with the investors. Mark followed her lead, doing his best to fit into this new world. It wasn't the first time he had been around high-powered people, but it was the first time he was pretending to be someone he wasn't. He had to remind himself again this wasn't about him. This was about the deal, the arrangement. The meeting went on for hours, with Eleanor leading the discussions and Mark sitting quietly by her side, offering the occasional smile and handshake when needed. As the meeting concluded, Eleanor turned to him, a satisfied smile on her face. "That went well," she said. Mark nodded, though he wasn't sure what to feel. Was this really the life he wanted? Was this all he was now, a side player in someone else's world? As they left the meeting, Eleanor turned to him, her expression softening for the first time. "You're doing well, Mark," she said, her voice warmer than usual. "I know this is all a lot to take in, but you're handling it better than I expected." Mark glanced at her, unsure of how to respond. Her praise felt strange, like it wasn't meant for him, but for the role he was playing. He nodded but didn't say anything. There was a part of him that wanted to question everything, to ask her what this was all really about, but he knew better than to do that. His role was simple: play the part, and everything would be fine. That night, Mark sat alone in his apartment, the silence surrounding him like a blanket. He had kept his promise to Eleanor, but now he was starting to wonder what would happen once this arrangement was over. How long could he keep pretending? He thought back to the night he had signed the contract, the moment when everything had seemed so clear. But now, everything was murky. The line between fake and real was starting to blur, and Mark wasn't sure he knew where he stood anymore. The next morning, Eleanor called him with another request. "There's a family gathering this weekend. I need you to come with me. It's important that we maintain the image of the perfect couple," she said. "You'll be expected to act like we've been married for years. Just be yourself, but a little more polished." Mark didn't respond immediately. He knew what was expected of him, but a part of him wanted to break free, to escape this suffocating role he was playing. He had promised his mother that he would take care of her, but at what cost to his own happiness? Could he really live like this? The doubt weighed on him, but he didn't have the courage to question it yet. Instead, he agreed, knowing that his life was continuing down a path he hadn't expected. He wasn't sure where this would lead, but he knew one thing: couldn't keep pretending forever. How long will Mark continue to play this role? What will happen when he can no longer ignore the feelings building up inside? Stay tuned for the next part of the story. Mark's phone buzzed early the next morning, pulling him from a restless sleep. It was a message from Eleanor: "The family gathering is tonight. I expect you to be on your best behavior." He rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of the words press on him before his feet even hit the floor. He had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the life he had stepped into. Another event. Another night where he would pretend to be something he wasn't. It had been a week since the gala, and it felt like he had been playing this role for months already, even though it had only been a short time. His heart was no longer in it, but he didn't have a choice. He couldn't back out now. He had made a commitment. The house where the family gathering was being held was massive, opulent, with high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and dark wood furniture that screamed old money. Mark stepped out of the car and took a deep breath. Eleanor was by his side, her arm tucked in his, looking as pristine and composed as ever. She didn't seem to feel the weight of this life. To her, it was simply how things were done. He couldn't help but wonder if she even saw him as a person anymore, or just a necessary accessory to keep up the image. "Remember, Mark," Eleanor said in a low voice, "we're in this together. Play the part, and it will all go smoothly." She gave him a tight smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. They walked into the grand foyer, where the sound of laughter and conversation echoed off the walls. Family members, friends, and business associates were mingling, each one dressed to impress. Mark tried to hide his discomfort as he took in the scene. He had never felt more out of place. It wasn't just the wealth that made him feel small, it was the cold, calculated way everyone interacted with each other. No one here seemed to care about anything except appearances. Eleanor's family treated him like a stranger, exchanging polite smiles and half-hearted greetings, as if they had already made up their minds about him. He was the hired husband. The accessory. That's all he was to them. "Mark, darling, how are you?" A voice interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to see Eleanor's mother, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper smile. She looked him up and down, sizing him up as if he were a piece of property. "I hope my daughter is treating you well," she continued, her tone dripping with condescension. Eleanor stepped forward, immediately taking control of the conversation. "Mother, Mark has been wonderful. As always." Eleanor's voice was smooth, almost rehearsed. Mark couldn't help but feel like a puppet on a string. The whole evening was just a performance. Everyone was playing a role, including him. As the night went on, Mark found himself surrounded by business deals and shallow conversations. It was exactly what he had expected. No one asked him anything personal. No one cared about who he was or where he came from. He was just a prop, a figurehead to make Eleanor look good. But as the night wore on, something shifted inside him. A small part of him began to resent the life he had chosen. Was this really worth it? The money? The security? He hadn't signed up for tea, she had signed up for a way out, for a chance to fix his family's financial troubles. But now, as he watched Eleanor navigate the room with ease, laughing with business partners and exchanging pleasantries with her family, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was becoming a shadow in her life, fading into the background. It wasn't long before Eleanor's cousin, a man Mark had met only briefly at the gala, approached him. "So, you're the new husband," he said, eyeing Mark with a smirk. "Tell me, how does it feel to be a part of the family business? I've heard all about you." The comment stung. Mark forced a smile, trying to hide his frustration. "I'm just here to support Eleanor," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Of course," the cousin said, clearly not convinced. "Just don't forget, Mark. This family has high expectations. You don't get to play the part without playing by the rules." Mark's stomach churned at the implication. Was he really just a pawn to everyone around him? Eleanor had never mentioned the pressure he would be under to fit in, to be a perfect husband in public. She had promised him security, but at what cost? He found himself wondering if the life he had agreed to was worth all of this. But before he could dwell on it any longer, Eleanor appeared at his side, taking his arm possessively. "Let's get some fresh air," she said, as if sensing his unease. Mark didn't argue. He followed her outside to the balcony, the cool night air offering a brief respite from the chaos inside. Once they were alone, Eleanor turned to him, her eyes softening for a moment. "You did well tonight," she said, her tone lighter than it had been all evening. "I know it's a lot, but you're managing just fine." Mark nodded, though the words felt hollow. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They stood in silence for a moment, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Mark glanced over at Eleanor, trying to read her face. She was beautiful, poised, and so sure of herself. But for the first time since he had agreed to this arrangement, he wondered if she had any idea what it was like to feel small, to feel like you didn't belong. The night had been a test, and Mark had passed. But the cost was becoming clearer to him with each passing day. He had signed up for the financial security. But in return, he had lost something far more important, his sense of self. And as much as he tried to ignore it, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he was slowly losing the person he once was. Will Mark continue to play the role he's been given, or will he fight for something more? Stay tuned for the next part of the story. Mark stood on the balcony, staring out at the city below, trying to catch his breath. Eleanor had gone back inside, mingling with her family and business partners, but he couldn't shake the feeling that everything was starting to unravel. The weight of the evening, of the contract he had signed, was pressing down on him more than ever. He had thought that by marrying Eleanor, he would be securing a better future for his family, but now, standing here in the cold night air, he wondered if it had been the right decision. He hadn't signed up for this kind of life. The endless charades, the fake smiles, the constant pressure to fit in. It was all starting to take a toll on him. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm his racing thoughts. A part of him wanted to just walk away, to leave everything behind and figure out his own way forward. But then he thought of his mother, of the mounting debts, and the promise he had made to take care of her. Could he really throw all of that away? Could he walk away from this life and go back to nothing? The answer was clear: couldn't. He was stuck. Stuck in this contract, stuck in a life that wasn't his own, stuck with a woman he didn't love. But he couldn't help feeling like he had made a deal with the devil. Inside, Eleanor was still talking to her family, laughing, smiling, playing the perfect hostess. She seemed so at ease in this world, like she was born to live in it. Mark had tried to play along, but the longer he spent in her world, the more he felt like an outsider. A pawn in someone else's game. He wasn't even sure if Eleanor cared about him beyond what he represented. To her, he was a means to an end, a way to maintain her family's legacy and business dealings. To him, she was a symbol of everything he had given up. He shook his head, trying to push the dark thoughts away. He had to keep it together. Just a few more months, he told himself. Just get through this, and everything would be fine. But that feeling, that nagging doubt, wouldn't leave him. What if this was his life now? What if he was doomed to live in this fake marriage forever? He had no answers. All he had was the contract, the promise he had made, and the growing realization that he didn't know how much longer he could pretend. Mark was jolted out of his thoughts when he heard Eleanor's voice behind him. "Mark," she said, her tone calm but with an edge that made him turn around. "Can we talk?" She stood in the doorway, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to figure out what he was thinking. Mark nodded, feeling the tension in his chest tighten. He had a feeling this conversation was going to change everything. They stepped into a quieter part of the house, away from the noise of the party. Eleanor closed the door behind them, and for a moment, there was silence between them. Mark could feel the weight of her gaze on him, but he didn't meet her eyes. Instead, he focused on the floor, trying to steady his breath. "What's going on, Mark?" Eleanor asked, her voice softer now, but still filled with that sense of authority he had come to expect. "You've been distant lately. Is something bothering you?" Mark wanted to say something, wanted to tell her the truth, that he wasn't sure about this anymore, that he didn't know if he could keep pretending, but the words wouldn't come. He wasn't ready to confront the reality of his situation yet. "I'm fine," he said finally, though his voice sounded hollow even to him. "I just needed some air." Eleanor didn't seem convinced. She took a step closer, her expression unreadable. "Mark," she said, her voice quieter now, "I know this is difficult. But you knew what you were signing up for. You knew what this arrangement would be. You're here because I needed you, and you needed me. This isn't about love. This is about business. I don't know how many times I have to remind you of that." Mark looked up at her then, his eyes meeting hers. The words stung, but they also felt like a cold splash of reality. Eleanor was right, in a way. He had agreed to this. He had known what he was getting into. But that didn't make it any easier. The truth was, he was starting to feel more trapped than ever. He wasn't sure who he was anymore, or what he was becoming. "I know," he said quietly. "But sometimes it feels like I'm losing myself in this." Eleanor didn't respond right away. She seemed to be considering his words carefully, her gaze fixed on him as if she were searching for something beneath his exterior. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer but still firm. "I know this isn't easy, Mark. But we're in this together. And sometimes, we have to do what's necessary, even if it doesn't feel right. Trust me, I'm not doing this because it's easy for me either. But it's what we have to do." Mark nodded slowly, though he didn't feel reassured. There was no easy way out of this, he realized. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him was slowly breaking. What will Mark do next? Will he continue to play along, or will he find the courage to stand up for himself? Stay tuned for the next part of the story. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The conversation with Eleanor had left him more conflicted than ever. She was right in many ways. She had agreed to this arrangement. But the more time passed, the more he began to question everything. The nights of pretending, the constant pressure to live up to the perfect image, and the way Eleanor seemed so detached from the emotions that weighed heavily on him, it was all starting to take a toll. He had come into this with the promise of security for his family, but now, as each day passed, he wondered if that security was worth the cost of losing himself. The days following that conversation were a blur. Eleanor had been busy with business meetings, and Mark was left to his own thoughts more than ever. The emptiness in their marriage felt more profound than before, as though the space between them had grown wider with every passing day. They led separate lives, two strangers in the same home, playing roles in a marriage that didn't feel real. At times, Mark thought about walking away, but the fear of losing everything he had worked for, the debts, the responsibilities, the promise to his family, kept him rooted in place. But then, everything changed when Eleanor gave him a simple but unexpected invitation. She asked him to join her for a dinner with her closest friends and business partners. "It's important," she said, her voice tinged with something Mark couldn't quite place, perhaps urgency, or maybe just a hint of vulnerability. Eleanor never showed much emotion, and Mark had grown accustomed to that, but this time, there was something in her tone that made him hesitate. Was she finally acknowledging how strained their relationship had become? Or was this another one of her carefully planned moves to ensure their perfect public image? Mark agreed to attend, though he had no idea what to expect. The evening of the dinner, he dressed carefully, knowing that the slightest misstep would be noticed. The venue was a lavish restaurant, one of Eleanor's favorites, tucked away in the heart of the city. It was a place where business deals were made over fine wine and gourmet food. As they walked into the restaurant together, Eleanor's presence was commanding, as always. She greeted everyone with ease, her polished smile never wavering. Mark, on the other hand, felt like an outsider as he followed her through the crowd, offering polite smiles and making small talk with people he barely knew. The night was filled with endless conversations about investments, projects, and mergers. Mark tried his best to keep up, nodding along and offering his opinions when prompted, but the whole evening felt like a performance. He was playing the role of the perfect husband, just as Eleanor had instructed him to. But this time, something felt different. He had always known that Eleanor was driven by her ambition and her need for control, but tonight, as he watched her interact with her colleagues, he realized just how much of her life was a carefully constructed facade. She wasn't just living in a world of business, she had become consumed by it. And he, it seemed, was merely a pawn in her game. As the evening wore on, Mark found himself becoming more and more disillusioned. The conversations had all turned into small talk, the same superficial exchanges that never seemed to go anywhere. He caught a glimpse of Eleanor from across the room, laughing with a group of her associates, looking every bit the confident, poised woman she was. For a moment, he wondered if she even cared about him anymore, or if he had just become an accessory to her world. She had asked him to be there tonight, to continue pretending, but he wasn't sure if it was for her benefit or his. As the dinner came to a close, Eleanor took Mark's arm and led him out of the restaurant. The night air felt cool against his skin, but the silence between them was suffocating. They walked to the car without speaking, the weight of the evening settling heavily between them. When they finally reached their destination, Eleanor turned to him, her eyes softening for the first time that night. "You did well tonight," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I know this isn't easy, but we're in this together." Mark nodded, though he didn't feel the same sense of accomplishment she did. He had done well, but for whom? For her? For their image? Or for something else entirely? He wasn't sure anymore. The emptiness he had been feeling was growing, and he realized that he could no longer ignore it. He had done everything he was supposed to, but something inside him was starting to break. He couldn't keep pretending forever. The line between fake and real had blurred too much, and Mark knew that he couldn't keep living in this world where he was just a character in Eleanor's life. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he knew something had to change. He had been playing along for so long, but the truth was, he didn't know who he was anymore. He had given up so much, and for what? The promise of security, the illusion of love, or something else? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing: couldn't keep pretending. Not anymore. What will Mark do next? Will he confront Eleanor, or will he continue to live in this world of illusion? Stay tuned for the next part of the story. Mark lay in bed, the room silent around him, but his mind was far from calm. The weight of everything he had been pretending to be was finally beginning to take its toll. He had been living a lie for so long, playing a role in Eleanor's world, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the facade. The pressure had been mounting, the doubts growing stronger with each passing day. He knew he had made a choice, but now, he was starting to wonder if he had chosen the right path. The life he had thought would bring security for his family had come at a price: his own happiness, his own sense of self. He could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling that he was slowly losing himself. It was the following afternoon when he finally decided that enough was enough. He couldn't keep pretending, not anymore. He had to face Eleanor, tell her the truth about how he felt. The contract, the role, the act, it all had to end. He couldn't live this way, not with his heart so heavy, so torn. He wasn't even sure what he wanted anymore, but he knew he couldn't keep going down this road. It wasn't just about the money or the security anymore. It was about his life, his happiness. Eleanor had always been clear that this was just business, but Mark had thought that it could evolve into something real. But now, it was clear to him that it would never be that way. He found her in her office later that day, as usual, working away, completely immersed in the world that seemed so far removed from his own. She didn't look up when he entered, her focus completely on the papers in front of her. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her, unsure of how to begin. The words felt stuck in his throat. But he knew he had to speak them. He couldn't wait any longer. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low but steady. She looked up, her eyes meeting his with that same cool composure. "We need to talk." Eleanor's gaze softened, but only slightly, as if she sensed something was wrong. She nodded, pushing aside the papers and gesturing for him to sit. Mark took a deep breath before speaking again. "I can't do this anymore. This arrangement, this marriage, it's not what I signed up for. I came into this thinking I could handle it, thinking I could pretend. But I can't. Not anymore." There was a long silence as Eleanor processed his words. She didn't seem surprised, but she didn't react immediately either. Mark could see the wheels turning in her mind, the way she carefully measured her response. Finally, she spoke, her tone measured but still firm. "Mark," she said, "I know this hasn't been easy. I never expected it to be. But you knew what you were getting into from the start. This was always going to be a business arrangement, not some fairy tale. You agreed to this for a reason." She paused, her eyes scanning his face as if trying to read him. "You knew the stakes." Mark shook his head. "I thought I could live with it. I thought I could accept it, but it's eating at me. Every day, it's getting harder to ignore how I feel. I don't want to be just a part of your image, Eleanor. I don't want to be the perfect husband for the cameras, just for the sake of appearances. I want more than that. I want something real." Eleanor didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, her expression unreadable. Mark could feel the weight of her gaze, and for a moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake. Maybe he was asking for too much, maybe this was how it was always going to be. But then Eleanor sighed, a deep, almost imperceptible sound. "I never promised you love, Mark," she said quietly, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "This was never about love. It was about necessity. But I understand now that what we've built, what we've created, it's not enough for you. I thought you could accept that, but clearly, you can't. And I'm not going to force you to." Mark's chest tightened at her words. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it feel final, made it feel real. He wasn't sure what he had hoped for when he signed that contract, maybe a chance at something more, maybe just a way to make things right for his family. But in the end, he had realized that he couldn't keep living in this world, pretending to be someone he wasn't. So what now? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes hardening with the same steely resolve that had always defined her. Now, she said, you do what you need to do. And I'll do the same. It was over. The marriage, the arrangement, the illusion, it was all falling apart. Mark didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: it was time to step away, to find his own path. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild his life from here. He didn't know where he was going, but at least he was taking the first step. What will Mark's future hold? Will he be able to find peace and happiness again? Stay tuned for the next part of the story.